Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be diving into our weekly segment of rating NFL teams that lost this past weekend on the panic meter of how close they are to, really having to make a drastic move. The example that we used last week is the Panthers benching Bryce Young for Andy Dalton. That was a 10 out of 10 on the panic meter. Now, obviously, they benefited from that move, but those are the sort of extremes that we're talking about. So we're going to be running through, starting with the losses that were suffered last night in Monday Night Football. The Jacksonville Jaguars are a 9 at this point. 1 being no worries whatsoever, 10 being pressing the panic button, of course, and the Jaguars were already playing with fire coming into this week. It has been a really bad product for them. You're talking about overall here, this is probably the 5 straight halves of football that they've looked really bad. I know that they looked better, I suppose, in the second half of that Bills game. Maybe you don't want to chalk that up to being all that bad, but overall here, this has just been a brutal stretch for the Jaguars, who are coming into this season, paying Trevor Lawrence this massive contract with expectations that now they're going to continue to ramp up into returning to being real contenders like they thought they were in 2022. And the opposite has proven true up to this point. The offense is a mess. The defense is a mess. I think that we are probably, counting down the days at this point to seeing Doug Peterson end up getting fired and the Jaguars trying to, make something happen. I think that they are just a very messy organization at this point, and I should have known better than, betting behind the infrastructure of this Jaguars franchise that has been poorly run for some time into thinking that they were actually going to be able to live up to the potential that they have. Because I do still think that they're a talented roster, but it has been nothing but a mess up to this point in the year. So they are probably knocking on the door of hitting that panic button and firing Doug Peterson. The other loss from last night, Cincinnati Bengals. Following last week's loss, I had them at a 4, and I still really do want to believe that this is a good football team. And I do believe that they're a good football team, but you can be a good football team. It's still really hard to overcome an 0-3 start to the season. And ultimately, I feel like this is a situation where, you can talk yourself into the offense, and I do think that Burrow and Chase and Higgins are only going to continue to improve on that side of the ball now that Higgins and Chase are fully integrated, no longer holding out or no longer dealing with injuries, that they should be a competitive game week in, week out. But this year is about making the playoffs for them. And now they have a very uphill battle in front of them to try and overcome this hole that they've dug themselves into. And with 2 of the losses coming as 7.5-point favorites, there's something, this might just be the season that was brought from hell, considering the fact that T. Higgins and Jamar Chase were such big question marks heading into the year. Trey Hendrickson as well, your best player on defense. He had requested a trade at one point. So vibes definitely seem off with this team. They're almost at that full panic level, but I still also am confident enough in the talent that's on the roster that I'm not willing to fully rule them out in terms of postseason just yet. I have them as a 7. Cleveland Browns, in the same division, have one more win than the Bengals. So there is a good chance here that maybe I'm too high on the Bengals, but the reality of the situation is the Browns have looked disastrous every game of this season. The Bengals, at least, were competing, and there were flashes of a lot of good things on the offensive side of the ball. You can make an argument that they should have beat the Chiefs. Not going to talk about that pass interference call. But the Browns have just been so ugly of a football team, and just as a roster as a whole. Listen, I'm always for, good defense and sort of winning games in the trenches and such, but the Browns have a good defense, not quite the elite defense that they had last year. Plus, Myles Garrett is currently day-to-day with that foot injury that he sustained in the end of that Giants game. So, we'll see on that. Shouldn't be too long-term for them, but the offense has given them absolutely nothing to feel confident about up to this point, where after being basically gift wrapped a touchdown to start that game against the New York Giants when they fumbled the opening kickoff, and ultimately, Watson made a nice throw to Amari Cooper for the touchdown. They didn't even reach they reached actually the Giants side of the field once in that game, and then proceeded to get a false start penalty, so didn't actually even run a play in Giants territory until the second half, where Devin Singletary fumbled on his side of the field. So that offense is just so uninspiring at this point. The offensive line has been a disaster for them. That was one of the strong suits of them. They lost their offensive coordinator in Alex Van Pelt. You have to wonder whether or not that is playing a factor in here. But ultimately speaking here, I think that the Browns are in a very messy situation. The Houston Texans, they suffer their first loss of the season against the Minnesota Vikings, a team that coming into this year had zero expectations for them for the most part, and are doing a very good job up to this point of punching above their weight class. The Vikings are 3-0. The Texans on the other side of this, I think that this is a situation that shouldn't be too messy, all things considered. Nobody else in the division feels like all that much of a threat. A lot of people like the Colts. I'm a lot lower on the Colts, I think, overall in terms of the now. Anthony Richardson still has a lot of growing, I think, to do, and that offense just has looked like a mess up to this point. But the Texans, for this game, they are going to be able to... For the Texans, they were without their top two running backs this past week in Joe Mixon and in Dameon Pierce. They should be able to bounce back moving forward here. I'm not worried about them really whatsoever. This is a team that's pretty clear-cut to me that should win their division, and I still think that they're ultra-talented. Stars just weren't aligned here. Vikings, it's a tough place to play in Minnesota. I think this is more about the Vikings actually being a good team than there being some real flaws with the Texans. So I have them at just a 2, which is similar to where I had the 49ers last week. But we'll get into them shortly here. The Miami Dolphins. They're a 9 on the panic meter to me. And this is primarily about the injuries sustained to, of course, quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. And then this past week, they went in starting Skylar Thompson, who has been, a semi-reliable backup these past couple years. And then you find out that he got smoked. I can double check the numbers here. I think I saw that he was sacked something like 5 or 6 times, and that might actually be underselling it a little bit. I can do my double check here, but Skylar Thompson getting rocked into having a rib injury, and now he is out for who knows how long. Mike McDaniel spoke earlier this morning and said that the next 48 hours should be when the Skylar Thompson should have the next 48 hours to potentially see whether or not he's going to be available to play moving forward here. But Tim Boyle stepped in for them. Ultimately, this was never a game that they were really going to win. Can't believe this wasn't a game that I included in my best bets this past weekend. Seahawks were such a lock there, knowing that, the Dolphins quarterback situation is as messy as it is. As for now, it seems like Tim Boyle is going to be their starting quarterback. Tyler Huntley or Snoop Huntley is the backup there. We'll see if maybe he is able to win that rollover. But Dolphins without an explosive offense, I think, is a very bad situation to be in. And, their version of hitting the panic button might just be making a trade for a quarterback, and maybe they can dial things back in. But this is a tough situation for Miami to be in at this moment, but I have them at a 9 right now, considering all of that. Now moving on to the NFC, the Dallas Cowboys suffering their loss to the Baltimore Ravens. This is a 7 for me on the panic meter. The Cowboys are a team that I have been concerned with basically headed into this season. And yes, they were able to really take it to the Browns, which even considering what I think about the Browns, I mean, you do have to give the Cowboys credit for what was a good game then, and that's still a good Browns defense that the Cowboys were able to score on. But that being said, we're going back-to-back weeks of their defense just getting mauled on the line of scrimmage, them losing the line of scrimmage battle up front themselves. Feels like this is really just Dak is going to have to sort of backpack this team to a winning record, which for the record, I think that Dak, is it a little bit of stat padding? Maybe that in the fourth quarter he was able to, get his team back into this game. But I don't think that Dak's the problem with this Cowboys roster at the moment. They have a lot of holes across the board. And yes, part of that ties into how much money they're allocating to Dak, but that doesn't even, come into play this season. So I don't think that Dak can be the full scapegoat here. There's a lot of issues that this Cowboys team has, and I think that they are already a team that I was nervous about coming into the year, and basically all those issues of their offensive line and their running game being non-existent. Now you add into it that their defense is able to just be ran through. This is a team that I think could be in a lot of trouble. They're still very much in the mix at still 1-2, but I'm going to need to see a serious recalibration of who this team is moving forward. The San Francisco 49ers, last team on the list here. I have them slightly more panicked than I was at with them last week. Like I mentioned, they were a 2 last week. Now they're at a 3. This is getting to a point where the injuries that are stacking up are pretty detrimental to them. Just found out that defensive tackle Javon Hargrave is going to miss the entire regular season as well. But he could return for the playoffs. And that is ultimately my point with the 49ers, that they should be in great position to make the playoffs this year. I still think, even though you have Deebo Samuel not playing for you right now, Christian McCaffrey is on the IR, that I think they're going to be able to, hang around, and that they should still be a playoff team. But, it's something to keep an eye on, that maybe this is just a situation. George Kittle, of course, ended up being out for last game, so the injury squad almost pulled off that game against the Rams in what was ultimately the injury bowl. I thought Brock Purdy looked pretty good. I think that they will be able to bounce back moving forward, but definitely keeping an eye on those injuries. And the last couple teams here I want to talk about are the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the New Orleans Saints, who sort of lit the world on fire to differing degrees through the first couple weeks, that both of them sort of early on in the season became the darlings, and now are in some situations where they're both coming off of disappointing losses, where Buccaneers losing to a Broncos team that had looked very bad offensively through the first couple weeks. Bo Nix finally looked like an NFL quarterback, which, credit to him, I was very much encouraged by what I saw from him, but never feels good to be the other team that sort of allows that to happen. And their offense as well looked like a lot of a mess in that game. And, the Broncos, credit their defense as well. I think their front seven and how well they've played up to this point in the season has been one of the most surprising aspects of the season to me. That being said, though, 7 sacks in that game allowed. That is on the offensive line that is supposed to be at least a solid group, and it's on Baker Mayfield, who I thought was holding onto the ball way too often. And then the Saints, on the other hand, the Eagles just continued to shoot themselves on the foot and keep playing, and somehow still that Saints offense that put up 91 points, I believe it was, through the first 2 weeks of the season was unable to capitalize. So I want to sort of dive a little bit further into these games in particular and the NFC South as a whole, which has been just so tumultuous up to this point. You got the Panthers now, seem like they could maybe be a good team, and you have the Falcons, who are still sort of hanging in no man's land. So I want to break down where that division is at, and sorry there. I want to break down those teams in particular and talk about where the NFC South is at moving forward. Before we do go to break here, I want to address a couple questions here in the comment section from Alex here. Is Hunter Henry a good starting tight end for fantasy football? I think that Hunter Henry is going to get targets at least to some degree, considering the fact that that Patriots offense really doesn't have any wide receivers. That being said, I'm hesitant because the Jets sort of showed the blueprint last Thursday night that if you just put pressure on that running game and take that away, there is very little that Patriots offense is going to be able to do. They have the worst offensive line in the NFL, and ultimately, somebody is going to have to get targets, but I don't know how many targets are necessarily going to be distributed. I would keep Hunter Henry. I think he's worth a roster spot, and he's not a mess of an option by any means. At this point, tight ends have had a pretty slow start to the season that I think that Hunter Henry could be a good start moving forward. But that being said, I think that I would probably try and opt for another option. I don't think the ceiling is particularly high in an offense that isn't really going to be prioritizing the pass game. But we are now going to be diving into that NFC South furthermore here. But first, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.